Are we on? Here we are. Hello, everybody. Hi, and good morning. I think we're going live now, I believe. Yep, we are. Right, sorry about that. It's my fault. So I'd like to welcome members to the third meeting of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee in 2021. Our first item today is to invite Oliver Mundell to declare any relevant interests. Oliver has joined the committee in replacement for Jamie Halcrow-Johnson, and at this point I'd like to place on record my and the committee's thanks for Jamie's work on the committee. And Oliver, I would now like to invite you to declare any relevant interest, please.
I have no relevant interest to declare.
Okay, well, thank you very much. You're welcome to the committee. And our second item today is for the committee to agree to take agenda item 6 in private, which is consideration of the evidence we will hear today on public appointments, and the members agree to take this item in private. No one says anything other, so that seems fine, thank you. Okay, agenda item 3 then. Our next item is for the committee to agree that our consideration of guidance on the code of conduct for MSPs and our legacy report should be taken in private at future meetings. The members agree to take these items in private at future meetings, please. Well, thank you very much for that. All right then, let's move on to some business. And agenda item 4 is for the committee to take evidence in relation to public appointments. And joining us today, I'm pleased to say we've got Kate Forbes, MSP, Cabinet Secretary for Finance, and Helen Miller, the Acting Head of Public Appointments. Yep, there we go. Nice to see you both. And I would like to invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a short opening statement, please.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thanks to the committee for having me today. Ministerial public appointments are obviously a unique part of public life, but they are absolutely essential. There are currently 717 ministerial public appointments across 90 public body boards. They're vital roles, and to start with, I'd like to record my thanks to those who serve on those bodies, because their commitment, as well as the skills and the expertise they bring, is hugely appreciated. Most appointments are made for 3 or 4 years, and reappointments can be made for up to a maximum term of 8 years. On average, there are 50 recruitment rounds a year, resulting in the appointment of between 120 and 150 people a year. Reappointments and extensions of appointments are also made annually. In all of that, the Ethical Standards Commissioner plays an important role in that process. As you know, the Commissioner is required to publish a code of practice on how appointments to bodies are made by the ministers and the methods and the practices used in making them. The code is to include guidelines on how vacancies are to be publicised, how to encourage applications for vacancies, and the Commissioner is required to keep the code under review and to promote compliance with it. In the Scottish Government, there are 11 people in the Central Public Appointments team, and they act as a centre of expertise to guide and support sponsor teams across the Scottish Government to deliver the public appointments process on behalf of Scottish ministers. The team have almost daily contact with the Commissioner's office, and they act to secure compliance and promote good practice across the organisation and public bodies. And I'm pleased that the process is delivered to a very high standard, with very few breaches of the code and no reports on material non-compliance to Parliament in recent years. I think that the current code provides a clear framework for officials to deliver the appointments process and to give ministers assurance that the people recommended for appointments have been through a recruitment process that is fair, transparent and based on merit. And I think the Commissioner and I share a commitment to see that the ministerial public appointments process is efficient and delivers a diverse range of candidates for appointments. When the Commissioner gave evidence to you in December, she suggested that the Scottish Government's response to the consultation and revisions to the Code of Practice was an outlier, and that it, and I quote, showed preference for the avoidance of scrutiny. That's not the case, and I'm very happy to give evidence today demonstrating why that is not the case. We absolutely respect the role of the Commissioner, we value her independent role, and we welcome proportionate regulation of the appointments process. That is important. Officials aim to work with the Commissioner's team in an open and transparent way. The consultation indicated that she has a preference for further prescription to be added to the code, And as the committee may be aware, the recruitment process for ministerial public appointments currently takes about 20 weeks. I'll stress that again, 20 weeks from ministerial agreement to proceed until the offer is made. I'm concerned, ministers are concerned, that adding additional steps to an already robust process could create unnecessary delay in the process and impact on the ability of public body boards to function efficiently and respond effectively to unexpected vacancies. And I know the timescales was an issue of concern for the committee as well. There's already also a risk, I think, that making an already rigorous process overly onerous may put off potential applicants. As we look ahead, as we respond to the current and long-lasting impact of COVID, EU exit, I think we've got an opportunity to facilitate and encourage flexibility in a revised code, and we're keen to work with the Commissioner to identify appointment approaches which will help to deliver greater efficiency in the rounds, to maximise the number of quality candidates and improve diversity and deliver value for money. And so, as I conclude, it's important that any code of practice is proportionate to the task at hand, clarifies the role of all parties and the expectations on everybody involved. I certainly welcome the opportunity for further discussion about any revisions to the code and also the Commissioner's plans for a regulatory strategy, and I would strongly encourage that kind of engagement. I recognise that our range of ongoing initiatives and activities to improve the diversity of public appointees have been affected by the unprecedented challenges of the pandemic. Throughout this enormously challenging period, we are seeing some significant improvements in diversity, but there's always further to go, and I'm interested in the committee's views in that regard. One of the most significant achievements is that 50% of public appointees are women, but we've also seen incremental improvements to the appointment rate of ethnic minority and disabled people, and we're determined to maintain that progress, to build on it, and recognise the support that the Ethical Standards Commissioner has provided in the past and will, I'm sure, continue to do in the future. So I hope that helps sketching out the Scottish Government's view, and very keen to hear the views of the committee on how best to secure a fair and efficient process that delivers diverse and effective candidates to serve on our public boards, which can only be for the benefit of the people of Scotland. Thank you, Convener.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Cabinet Secretary, for that. Okay, we will have a number of questions for you, and I'll just point out that because we're operating in the system we are at the moment, actually through this, through the remote access, I'll be taking people in order who have been circulated previously, just for the benefit of members, just to know that the first person who is invited to ask a question is Patrick Harvey, please. Patrick.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the Cabinet Secretary. Can I start with where you ended there on the impact of COVID? The Commissioner reported that as a result of the pandemic over the last year, a significant proportion of new public appointment activity was put on hold, and it was necessary to grant variations to the Code of Practice. Can you provide the committee with an update on that activity? To what extent activity that was paused has resumed? Is there a backlog? Are we catching up? And are there any areas where we're still falling behind?
I may take in on Helen Miller, who may have some comments on more of the practical and the technical elements of the processes and how they have changed as a result of COVID. We did have to delay a number of planned actions because of the impact of COVID. We are still considering how to take forward some of the actions in different ways as a result. In terms of actual appointments, since last March, many of them were suspended, with one exception being the Scottish National Investment Bank. But in terms of our approach to overall appointments and some of the action plans we have to improve diversity, there have been some of those approaches have been delayed, but we are still continuing to progress them. So I would distinguish between the actual core appointments, which, yes, had to be suspended due to COVID, and then secondly, in terms of changes that we would like to make to the process Those are continuing, but there have been delays to them. Helen, I don't know if you want to come in on any of the technical elements to the process.
That's right. No, so appointments were postponed between March and August last year, responding to COVID. The team are back at full capacity, and appointment rounds that have been delayed over that period were prioritised, along with boards that were new members to fill vacancies and to make sure that they were quorate. So we have a bit of a prioritisation, if you like, of which appointments we fill first. But we're back on track, and actually working remotely, I think, has helped us kind of catch up quite quickly, because we're able to facilitate meetings online and facilitate interviews online. So I would say we're almost on top of our backlog, but it is having an effect on how we plan for the year ahead.
So there is a residual part of that backlog which is still being worked through in terms of appointments, or have the appointments that were put on hold all now been completed?
I would say by the end of March we'll be back to where we were.
Okay, thank you. The Commissioner also expressed some concern, I think, with the response to the consultation on the Code of Practice, which suggested removing from the Code the methods and practices that are used by Scottish ministers in making appointments because, and I quote, "it is stifling innovation." Can you explain your reasoning for those arguments that you put across there, and other views that you may have about the regulatory arrangements?
Thanks. Yes, I'm aware that the Commissioner had suggested that in her evidence. We didn't suggest that the new code should not have methods and practices within it, but we did highlight the need for flexibility and suggested that a principles-based code may be one way to achieve that. So our response to the consultation question with suggestions about removal or rewording of the current code that would help to maintain an outcome focus and clarity about the roles of officials and the Commissioner was not designed to remove methods and practices, but was designed to consider how we might be more flexible where operational demand requires it. So in terms of our response, we want to see, well, I think it would be advantageous to move closer to accountability and to looking at outcomes rather than to have an overly prescriptive approach. And those concerns were echoed in other submissions as well to the consultation, with just to cite two, the Community Justice Scotland response, which said that there's a danger that being too prescriptive in the code reduces flexibility and limits ambition to look at new and different ways of encouraging and achieving greater diversity. The Scottish Public Services Ombudsman also talked about the need to ensure that there was flexibility. This is all about trying to deliver on the outcomes here, which are to ensure that there is more diverse appointments, that the process itself makes sense and doesn't take up to 20 weeks, and also ultimately delivers value for money. So that was our intention when it came to those comments about the methods and practices. It's not about avoiding scrutiny or regulation, but clearly, and I'm sure the committee will have done this as the Commissioner has done, there must be ways to improve the process, and therefore the code needs to allow for flexibility, and our suggestion was that a principles-based code may be one way to achieve that.
I mean, it's interesting that you say that your position on this is driven by a desire to improve diversity, because the final question from me, convener, would be about the Commissioner's annual report saying that ministers are not indeed accessing that pool of talent that exists, and that activity to try and improve diversity has continued to be diffuse, and that there's a lack of clear and convincing plans for achieving parity. Would you accept that conclusion? Would you contest it? Or why do you think the Commissioner drew those conclusions?
Well, I perhaps would answer in two ways, one about diversity and then one about that conclusion. I don't think any of us are content with the level of diversity in our public board. So I would maintain, as I did in my opening comments, that there has been moves in the right direction. And I think that the figures attest to that. But those are incremental moves in many regards. And therefore, the more that we can do to boost the recruitment process to make it more diverse, the better. But I think the second part of my answer is about the process, because there's a distinction here to be made about roles. These are ministerial appointments. It's for ministers to agree what is required for the board to be able to exercise discretion. We're provided with a range of evidence to support our decision making. We have access to management information, good practice information, anonymised diversity data, etc., etc. The Commissioner already has significant oversight of the appointments activity, even though the scale of the operation is relatively small. So to give you some figures, of the 50 rounds per year, the Commissioner is cited on a majority of those rounds. And for example, in 2019, the Commissioner's advisors were assigned to 75% of those rounds. So whilst there's legitimate points here about diversity, I think the question is, well, how do we ensure that there's sufficient flexibility, sufficient ambition and sufficient innovation in the processes to deal with that issue? And secondly, it's not the government's position that we want to reduce scrutiny or we want to make the processes overly prescriptive, which then does not allow for sufficient innovation. And right now, the Commissioner's advisors are assigned to 75% of the rounds, using 2019 as an example. So hopefully that answers both parts of your question.
Thank you, Camilla.
Okay, thank you very much, Patrick, and thank you, Minister. Just before we go to Maureen Watt, there's a wee point of clarification sought by John Scott. John?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Can you just explain to me, and possibly others, what you mean by a principles-based code? You said it twice, and if this is going to be the new theme, perhaps you'd explain what the principles might be.
Yeah, so what I mean by that, and again, I might bring in Helen on the more technical side, but moving away from a focus on compliance of technical issues and the operational work of government to principles, outcomes and accountability. So, for example, you can, an example of why a shift might be needed. Currently, the Commissioner's advisors sit on selection panels. They get involved in the fine detail of an appointment round. They will check, they will comment on paperwork, etc. Now, I think that is an operational responsibility of officials, of Scottish Government. In the rounds, they are
Lost.
Using more search engines when seeking people with specialist skills, running more joint rounds, creating a pool of pre-qualified people to help reduce the 20-week.
We're having problems here. We're having problems here at the moment with Kate. Is it possible? That Helen, could you pick up a wee bit, because I think the Minister was going to come to you there. Do you want to?
That's fine. So I think what the Cabinet Secretary was alluding to was a focus in the code around principles for how we work with the Commissioner and her team, and that some of those principles could be around flexibility and being able to use different methods to attract different sorts of people. So some of the things that we're interested in include more joint recruitment rounds, creating a pool of pre-qualified people to put forward to try and reduce that 20-week waiting list, being able to use maybe search executive consultancy for people who have very specialist skills, and really, I suppose, working with the Commissioner to understand and set some principles for how we work together and go forward. So, and that would be around things that are already part of the process, like transparency, accountability and outcome focus, and maybe a discussion and agreement about merit and how that plays out in public appointments.
Thank you very much, Helen. Is that okay then, John?
I would have to say no. I'm not
Okay.
clear about that at all. I couldn't hear Kate Forbes, and I regret to say that it wasn't clear really what was meant by the response from her assistant, whose name I don't have. I'm sorry.
Helen there, that's
No,
okay. Kate is back. Well, Kate is back actually with us. Actually, because of the system, it come up. Apologies, I'm back, but she is back. Cabinet Secretary, could you just come back again,
Yeah.
please?
Yes, sincere apologies for that. In a nutshell, I would say that you can either focus primarily on technical compliance in a process, so making sure that every element of the process is delivered in an appropriate way, or you can focus on outcomes. So if the outcomes that we're seeking to achieve here are, for example, increased diversity, they are value for money, and they are an efficient process, then those to me are principles that we're trying to deliver on. And if you're trying to focus on outcomes, you can have a bit more flexibility with the process. So you get less caught up in what search engine you're using. I'm using that as a silly example, but you can get less caught up in that because you're aiming for the principled outcomes rather than technical compliance with the process. I don't know if that helps make this clearer.
I'm not sure that it does, Kate. We're talking about budgets here of £17 billion, and I think it really needs to be very clearly defined. I'm sure there's maybe some work to be done on that as to how you're going to change the system for the better, because I'm not sure what you've told me is sufficient.
Perhaps I would refer you to some of the other responses to the consultation, which again talked about this point around prescription. So there needs to be obviously a code of practice. It needs to be absolutely clear. You can either be overly prescriptive and focus on compliance with the details of a technical process, which is important, and lose sight of the outcomes you're trying to achieve, or you can focus on the outcomes and allow for a little bit more flexibility in the technical process.
Right. Okay. Right. Okay. Well, thank you, John. Thank you. And as I say, we're going to be going to Maureen Watt, but just quickly with Neil Finlay, please, just to finish off on this element.
Just a very fundamental question. Can somebody explain why it takes 20 weeks?
Yes, I can, and I can bring in Helen to this as well. 20 weeks is far too long. 20 weeks perhaps demonstrates the point that I was just making of technical processes that are overly onerous. There are some reasons, for personal reasons, why it takes longer, but that to me is not acceptable. A 20-week wait is not acceptable, and we should be trying to reduce that by making sure that the process works. Helen, do you want to come in on any of the detail?
Yeah, so I would say that it takes a long time because for every single vacancy we have to start another round, and we'd like to look at ways that we can maybe sort of change that and create a pre-qualified pool of people to be able to put them forward for interviews where vacancies come up, whereas at the minute we have to get permission from the Minister to start. The Minister advises a selection panel. The selection panel have to be gathered together, a fresh selection panel for every single round. That selection panel is made up of senior people. There's a whole range of sort of operational issues to get diaries in order and to set out the timetable for the round. you have to advertise the roles for a certain period of time. You need time to do sifts of applications, time to get the panel in order, time to do the interviews, time to make the recommendations to Minister, and then for the Minister to make their choice, and then sometimes the Minister will choose to meet with the candidates. So all of that takes a long time and takes a lot of operational sort of organisation behind the scenes, and we do think it needs to be better, and we're keen to work with the Commissioner to look at how we can do that better.
Neil?
The process sounds no really any different from recruiting any employee, where you have a role, you advertise the job, you get applicants, you put together an interview panel, you interview them, and then you appoint them. That sounds no different from any other vacancy. The fact that it's a public appointments, so be it. How it takes 6 months is just incredible and completely and utterly unacceptable. I understand that the people who are coming together are busy people and they're all high flyers to, make up panels and all that kind of stuff. But 20 weeks is if business worked on a 20-week recruitment schedule, they'd be closed down. So for me, it is completely unacceptable. There are no excuses for a 20-week period.
If I could come back in, Neil Findlay hits the nail on the head. That is precisely the substance of our argument just now. The Commissioner requires all of those steps. We're saying in our submission that a 20-week wait is completely unacceptable, and therefore the process, and it's the process that is dictating that 20-week wait, the process needs to be more flexible. One small example is what Helen just suggested, being a pool of pre-qualified people. Now, that's the kind of flexibility that we're looking for in a principles-based approach, rather than in a technical, prescriptive, step-by-step process that takes currently 20 weeks. And that's where I would, in terms of the committee's role, I welcome this kind of discussion, because it illustrates the problem, and there's a plea there for changing it. Let's change it. Let's make it innovative. Let's make it more flexible, so we actually get the best person at the end of the day, rather than having followed every step required to make it last 20 weeks.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that. Thanks, Cabinet Secretary. Thanks, Helen Miller. And you've been waiting a wee while now, but Maureen Watt, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Cabinet Secretary, I realise that this is not top of your agenda at all, but excuse me, I think you're being ill-advised by your officials here. And I speak as an HR specialist, but also a former assessor of public appointments. Yes, the interview process at 20 weeks is ridiculous. But for example, ministers don't need to get the whole application form and everything to go through and sign off right at the beginning. Ministers, as you know, do not always meet the 3 or 4 recommended candidates before making a choice, unless it's a very senior and important appointment. Yes, it's difficult to get chairs of health boards and civil servants and whoever's on the panel together, and that could be streamlined, but I don't think you can blame the process. I think it's that just this whole thing is not given by the civil service the due recognition of its importance that is required. So one of the things about a lack of diversity of people coming forward is that the job description is often not as robust as it could be. And the Commissioner published a report on the 5th of February containing some findings from a survey of recent appointees to public boards, and she found that 62% of respondents stated that the time commitment needed for the role is more than advertised. Now, that's particularly the case, having been a health minister, in terms of health board appointments, and particularly the chair of the board, which is more or less a full-time job, but I think it's advertised as 3 days a week or less than that. So isn't it time that the job description was more accurate to reflect what the time commitment is, so that people are aware upfront as to what commitment they are making if they take on a public role?
Thanks for that. And I am aware of those survey results, and my officials are currently reviewing those figures and those findings, and will respond formally to the Commissioner in due course. You're right in saying that the job description needs to be accurate, and again, where there are changes that can be made, I'm very open to considering those changes. Those roles are not employment. They are a form of public service. People are contributing to the governance structures of our most important public bodies, and I recognise people's contributions, grateful to everyone who serves. Most appointees are remunerated for their time, but it's important to recognise that it's not a salary replacement. They're obviously able to claim expenses for travel and for childcare, and they're able to access statutory maternity pay and sick leave, and they're also able to claim for extra time given to board duties. Now, remuneration and time commitments are clearly set out in those application packs, so they are aware of the expectations of the role from the outset. If there is more information or less information or different information that needs to be included in those application packs, then all be it. They are given full inductions, which include arrangements for expenses, and then a discussion with the board chair about the time commitments and the time management. So there's a formal element to that information, and then there's an informal element in terms of overall conversation. In terms of NHS chairs and non-exec members, they receive an annual sum of remuneration based on a time commitment of 3 days per week for chairs and 8 hours per week for members.
Maureen?
But this seems to be a system that was devised and doesn't reflect modern day society, where most people work. Most people, yes, want to do public service, but that's got to be able to fit in with the other jobs that they've got. Otherwise, you are never going to get diversity in appointments with more women, more people with disabilities, or people from the BAME community. So it is important that the true amount of commitment is reflected at the beginning. Otherwise, you're going to appoint people and they're not going to be able to fulfill their appointments, and then you increase the workload in terms of having to replace them. So, it is really important, for example, with people with caring responsibilities, that they do know up front what the job entails. Otherwise, there is a kind of perception of mine, I don't know if it's shared with other members, I think perhaps it is, that you're still going to get middle-class retirees and a bunch of civil servants, retired civil servants, taking up the jobs, which is not in any way contributing to the diversity that we want on boards.
I would agree with that. So I would agree with that. So in terms of clarity up front, I will take that away. I think there is clarity up front, but if there's more that we can do in terms of being clearer up front, then I'm all for making improvements and changes to this, particularly, as you said, Maureen, about attracting those who can only work in a more flexible fashion around other jobs or around caring responsibilities. So point taken on making sure that there is as much robust information at the outset as possible. Secondly, though, having spoken myself at a number of these induction events and heard directly from those that have just been recently appointed, I don't know how many I've done now, but quite a number over the last 2 years, it's helpful to get feedback directly from individuals in those rooms on their experience of the process. Some of them are reappointees as well, so they've done it for a while, and hearing directly and making sure that we take that information and we add it into the recruitment packs. Currently, I'm sure all of us as MSPs know, these are challenging jobs. Any of us that have had any engagement with our local health boards or have had engagement with other local boards, they are publicly accountable. There's intense and scrutiny of their roles. These are tough jobs, and I think the more that we can do to support those that are appointed and the more information we can provide up front, the better.
Okay, thanks. I'll leave it there at the moment, Convener. Thank you. I'll let others in.
Well, thank you very much, Maureen. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Also, John Scott, please.
Thank you, Convener. I want to talk about socio-economic diversity, and the Cabinet Secretary will be familiar with the tables that we've been provided with, Table 5, wherein it says that 78% of the Scottish population are in the private sector, and in that context, only 27% of the people are appointed from the private sector, whereas 21% of the population in Scotland are in the public sector, and that results in 45% of the appointments. And further, 4.1% of the population are in the voluntary sector, and that results in 14.1% of the appointments. To start with, Minister, can you just explain why you think that is? Why is there such a low number of people applying and being appointed from the private sector?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thanks. If employment background information is broken down across DGs, we see far more people from the private sector apply for boards in some DGs than others. For example, in 2019, 84% of applicants for board roles in the Scottish Exchequer had a private sector background. If you compare that to health and social care, only 29.5% had a private sector background. So I think for the numbers to be meaningful, we need to go beyond the headline high-level figures to understand. What we need to focus on is getting the best people into the right roles, and we welcome people from all backgrounds. We set out what we need individuals on a board to deliver, then officials and selection panels work to deliver the people with the right skills, experience and knowledge. So I don't think it's a straightforward picture. The motivations that people will have to serve on a board will vary hugely. They may be particularly passionate about an issue that a board deals with, or they may have a more general desire to make a contribution to public life or to develop professionally. We know that from anecdotal evidence, and this goes back to some earlier questions that I've been asked, that people from private sector backgrounds can find the public appointments process daunting. We just talked about a few questions ago about the difference between this appointment process and an appointment process for any employment. And therefore, our engagement teams need to work hard to demystify the process for people who might not be familiar with public sector recruitment and make it as simple as possible. I again go back, though, to my comment around it being outcomes rather than prescriptive, because we can't further complicate the process. The one thing we should be absolutely striving to do is not to overcomplicate the process, so that when somebody does apply, they apply well, and as do people from voluntary sector organisations as well.
John Scott.
Well, thank you. I know your use of the word daunting for people from the private sector applying, and I agree with you, Cabinet Secretary, that we must focus on outcomes, but your principles-based approach to me seems to suggest that it might be less rigorous than it has been hitherto. Neil Findlay's point, well made, was that the process should just work more efficiently and be better rather than less efficient. and less rigorous. And I do think you need to be very careful about where you go with your principles-based approach. And just go on to further questions, if I may, Convener. And I want to ask you specifically, what is your understanding of the factors which mean that people from higher income households are more likely to be appointed to boards? Why do you think that is?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yeah, I'll again answer that as why I think it is and then what we need to do to change it. So in terms of why I think it is, it's largely because the skills and the knowledge that those roles often require, for example, financial management, tend to come from experience in management and executive roles, which as a rule often have a higher salary reward. That isn't always the case. I hasten to add that isn't always the case, but it is a factor in recruitment to public appointments. I know that figures about household income were presented to the committee. That is data that's collected by Scottish Government at application stage on household income. Almost a quarter of respondents ticked prefer not to say when it comes to the data on household income. So I don't think the data on household income is as robust as it could be because of that. I don't think that household income as a means in and of itself is a good measure, and it's not a good proxy for issues concerning other socio-economic background or socio-economic status. We need to focus on improving the representation of people from protected groups, and will take steps to better identify ways to monitor and report on socio-economic status or background of public appointees. So hopefully that answers it in two parts. Why do I think that's the case right now, and what do we need to do to try and change that?
Which I suppose takes us on to the broader picture then, since you don't want people apparently with established managerial abilities. So what role does the definition of merit have to play here? How are you going to judge people who are meritorious and suitable of appointment? Because we're talking about half of the Scottish budget here, £17 billion, give or take the half of the Scottish budget that's being administered by these groups. So presumably you would want some people with managerial expertise in that cohort of people.
Absolutely. And I don't think there's been any suggestion that we don't want people that are based on merit. We want a process that is fair, that's transparent, and is based on merit. And we need to make sure that the process allows for as diverse a range of candidates as possible to apply and then be appointed on the basis of merit. But that's where taking very narrow views of things. So, for example, you talked about socio-economic background. Just using the household income as a way of quantifying those coming from different socio-economic backgrounds, I don't think does the issue justice, because the point I've just made is that many of these roles require particular experience, i.e. based on merit, that would often come from managerial roles, and that often means a higher salary or a higher reward. So it's a very narrow way of determining socio-economic background. That merit is essential. We can't have public boards without people of experience and who are appointed on merit.
Well, I'll go to my final question, which is that the Commissioner published a good practice case study on the Poverty and Inequality Commission Board recruitment round. What were the features of this round which made it a success, and what is the government doing to roll out and embed this approach?
Yeah, so on this, I will bring Helen in, because it's talking about a specific example. Helen, do you want to come in on that?
So the Poverty and Inequality Commission was seeking a brand new board, so they were looking at what skills and experience they would need for the people around the table, and they identified that they would need experience from people who had lived in poverty or had real life experience of working with people who had lived in poverty. And the selection panel and the selection chair were really clear about the skills that they needed around the table. And part of the way that I think that it's an example of good practice is because they set a criteria when they were recruiting that asked specifically about people's experience and real lived experience, and they set that in a criteria, and they were able to get lots and lots of applications from people who matched the criteria that they'd set out. I suppose what I would say about that example is, you know, I don't think it's that different to what happens for every single round. So for every single round, the selection panel have management information and diversity information. They've got information about skills audit from the board. They've got information about what's required, and the selection panel will sit down and identify the criteria that they need to recruit against. So every single round is very specific about the skills and experience that they need, and they will set a plan, an advertising plan, an outreach plan to be able to get people who have those skills. So I suppose Scottish Government are really keen on good practice, and we really appreciate the Commissioner writing up the good practice, and we're able to share it across all of our selection panels and all of our sponsor teams. And I think that we're of the view that our current processes are pretty good at identifying that good practice and sharing it. But certainly the Poverty and Inequality Commission, I suppose, is a good example of how recruiting for lived experience, if you like, sort of was put into practice.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So you're
John, just before you move on, John, just before you move on, just on that you've been rolling through, if you don't mind, Gil and Neil would like to just come in the back of you, and then we'll move on with yourself again. That's okay. Gil Patterson, please.
Okay, thanks very much, Bill. Thanks for letting me in. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I'm very fortunate in a way because my constituency is split in two. I've got the highest paid people in the one postcode in Scotland, and I've got one of the lowest in the other part of my constituency. So, and the experience is entirely different in terms of appointments, etc. And there's a dearth of people in lower. I take your point on the definition. I would describe it more as lower income communities, and I wondered. When you used the words, and I wondered if the government think that the lack of lower income communities, the outcomes you spoke of several times, would justify the means in order to get lower income groups appointed, because there's no question about it. People who are in areas where deprived areas, etc. There's some very, very bright people, that's for sure, but they don't get the chance to engage. So I wonder if, in the engagement process, if that could be looked at.
And Cabinet Secretary?
I will. I'll take that away. Very open to suggestions that the committee makes, and I will take that away. I think there is some good practice, just in answer to John Scott's question about specifying lived experience, probably as a better way of identifying people. But secondly, being very intentional about going out and engaging properly and bringing people in and finding people that perhaps wouldn't ordinarily think of applying, but once they have the process has been slightly demystified and there's clear steps to take, that they would be more likely to apply. So I think we need to be more intentional about going to find people.
Thank you. Thanks very much for that. Thanks, Gil. Neil, did you want to follow up on this as well?
Yeah. If we look at the appointments, it's very predictable and right that, for example, on Poverty and Inequality Commission, we go and seek people with experience of living in poverty. But that's kind of predictable, isn't it? I think we won't make a breakthrough in this until we have people who have experience like that sitting on boards like the Scottish National Investment Bank, sitting on boards like Scottish Enterprise or Scottish Water, or sitting on health boards. So what are we doing? When I look at the figures here, we see that something like 70% of those who are appointed either won't say what their salary is, and I'm thinking in my own life that when I was skint, I was quite happy to tell folk I was skint. But the more that people earn, the more secretive they usually are in what they, how much they earn. But when you look at the other figures, if we add the prefer not to say and the people who are said how much they're earning, it's over 70% of people are in the highest income brackets. So what are we actually doing here to get people who are on low earnings, even average earnings, into some of these positions? Because the progress is pitiful.
Thank you. And Cabinet Secretary, please.
In answer to your first question, I would agree. So I will again take that one away in terms of learning from good practice that has worked in one appointment process, i.e. people with lived experience, and using that in other boards, and perhaps the more unlikely combinations, or the combinations that haven't been used in the past. So the short answer will be that we will take that away, and I'm very happy to come back to the committee in writing about what action we've taken as a result of the suggestions this morning.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you. Okay, and we go back to John Scott to let him finish off his questions, please.
Thanks, Convener. I haven't much more to say. I just think it's rather a sweeping generalisation, notwithstanding, for Neil to make, to say that the 22% of people in the category who prefer not to say are necessarily high income earners. I think there's a reticence amongst normal, good Scottish people just to not talk about money right across all levels of society, and it's not necessarily exclusively the wealthy.
Thank you very much. I don't know that that's for the Cabinet Secretary.
Any further questions? No, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. Thank you. Okay, and Neil, you had a question of your own, please?
Yeah, no, I think some of it has been covered. I mean, I would like to go back to the well, 2 points, I suppose. I think the issue of the class-based issue, the class issue is really important in this. If we look at the statistics, and I'll look forward to the Cabinet Secretary coming back to tell me what action they are going to take, so that when the Scottish National Investment Bank or some of the financial bodies are looking for new appointees, that they do appoint people who have got some real life experience of low pay and insecurity at work and poverty. So I look forward to that. I just want to add one thing, and we've covered some of it, but I would like to know, I wanted to follow up on the 20-week thing. Can the Cabinet Secretary come back to us and explain that at the moment I don't understand why it takes 20 weeks. Is the 20 weeks period written down as this is the time it starts, this is the time it finishes, or is that just how long it's taken at the moment? Or is that, is it a formal written down time period, or is it just how long it's taken?
It's not a formal written down. Sorry, it's not a formal written down process. That is just how long it takes. I would be very happy to write back to just illustrate all the steps that we are required to take, which extends it to 20 weeks. And again, to reiterate the point, why in our submission, Scottish Government submission, we made a plea for a more flexible, innovative process that would see that timescale reduce. Because I do think it's unacceptable. I think it's ridiculous that it's 20 weeks. But that is the end result of dealing with every step of the process. It can take shorter. I should emphasise it can be shorter, but it can take up to 20 weeks, and I don't think that is acceptable. Helen earlier talked about just one very small, minor example of ways in which it would take less, which is using different search engines or search agencies, running more joint rounds, creating pools of pre-qualified people to help reduce that. Those are all suggestions, and they are examples where moving away slightly from an overly prescriptive approach and being more flexible in the approach, these may seem like trivial issues that perhaps shouldn't even be discussed at committee in terms of creating pre-qualified pools of people or using different search agencies or running more joint rounds. But that's the kind of flexibility and innovation that we could incorporate to see that timescale reduced without compromising what John Scott just said, which is on rigour. It's not a suggestion that we compromise on rigour or indeed on scrutiny, but it is a suggestion that to deliver better outcomes, we need to, if we want to deliver more diversity, if we want to deliver more diversity on socio-economic issues, then I would suggest that doing this in a more flexible way, it would really help.
Yeah, I think what's clear is there is absolutely no reason why it should take 20 weeks. There is nothing written down why it should. So therefore, even within the current system, that can be sorted if there is the will to do it. But we'll wait on the Cabinet Secretary's correspondence.
Thank you very much for that, Neil, and thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for that. We'll see the correspondence when it comes in. Thank you for that. And Gil, please, Gil Patterson.
Thanks very much, Bill. Again, actually, you've covered the points, Millie. I mean, my main concern has been that we're missing a trick for the folks in lower income, and by definition, obviously, they're poor and not getting a chance. So I'm really pleased that the Cabinet Secretary said she would take it back. I mean, that's great, and I do take her point. The point that Neil Findlay raised in the first place is right, but I'm glad that the Scottish Government is on the case, and that's what they're actually looking for what Neil's asking. So, and we're going to get a report on that. So I don't have anything else to add. Thanks very much, Bill.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, Gil. And Oliver Mundell, please. Oliver.
Hi, thank you, Convener. I was keen, I know we've already talked a little bit about it, but just to return to protected groups, the Commissioner's report recognises that the gender balance was achieved ahead of schedule in 2019, which I think we can all welcome. But it was to ask why disability, age and ethnicity remain elusive, I think in the Commissioner's words. I really just to understand why you think there's still such a barrier for these groups.
Cabinet Secretary, please.
Yeah, I suppose the short answer is, again, that it needs to be bluntly a national endeavour to how we resolve areas where there are more incremental improvements rather than more substantial improvements on that. We are working with quite small groups of people. So I think I set out in my opening comments, we're working with between 120 and 150 appointments per year. We have had some success in improving the rate of appointment for disabled people and people from an ethnic minority. So you'll probably have the figures in front of you, but 2019, 6% of new appointments made were to people from minority ethnic backgrounds. That was up from 4% in 2018 and 2% in 2017. So we're starting from a very low percentage and building on that. And there's a similar trend when it comes to the disability figures. So 2019, 12% of new appointments were made to people who declared disability. That was up from 7% in 2018 and 6% in 2017. The large part of our work on equality to date has been to analyse the data and then to work with disabled people and ethnic minority groups to understand what the barriers are that they face and then take action to address that. I think there is the issue that's often cited, which is that if you can't see yourself represented on a board just now, and you don't want to be tokenistic, as it were, then there's a lot of hurdles to overcome. We're working to address that, to understand the barriers, analyse the data, and then take action to resolve that. But going back to the question that Gail Patterson and Neil Finlay both raised about how we reach certain groups, I don't think we can be content with just putting adverts up and waiting for people to apply. I think we need to be a lot more active in our engagement of going out there, of demystifying the process, of promoting appointments. And some of the current appointees have been very generous with their time in putting themselves forward and putting themselves out there in terms of publicity to demonstrate that there are people on our boards already, and more would be strongly welcomed. But it has to be a more flexible approach.
Thank you. And Oliver?
Thank you, Convener. Does that extend to young people as well? Again, I think my experience in terms of South of Scotland Enterprise, for example, is there are lots of young people in my constituency in the South of Scotland Enterprise area, who are very interested in the new organisation, but they wouldn't necessarily know that it had a board or how they would get involved in that. Do you think that there's enough outreach for young people in general? And then to follow up on in terms of the point on progress, how long would you expect in terms of kind of natural turnover if we're just appointing 150 new people a year? How long would you expect before we would see these protected groups represented to a level that replicates replicates the country?
On the first part, so young people have, well, it depends how you define young people, doesn't it? Because I was going to quote a figure for young people, but it is those under 50. So I'm sure anybody who is 49 will be chuffed to bits that I'm classifying them as a young person. So under 50s have been regularly steady at about 18% in terms of representation. But we are starting a work stream in collaboration with Napier University at the end of next year, I think it is, at the end of next year, on representation of young people and of reaching out to young people. So that's the point on young people. In terms of turnover and getting more representation, if you look at the trend that I just outlined, that's quite, I know it's incremental because it's starting from a low base, but that demonstrates that we're moving in the right direction quite consistently. And I think if we can continue to move in that direction, we continue to take the actions that I mentioned in answer to your first question, then we could start to see more substantial progress. So we will intentionally, to John Scott's point, we'll base it on merit, but we will very intentionally try and find ensure better representation of those groups in collaboration with those that represent those demographics, and hopefully build on that. You could argue that turnover is low on some boards because we get the right people in the first place, but we do need to build on those figures.
A date in mind, or a sort of a date target on disability or ethnicity, for example? Do you have
I don't have a date or a target.
Okay, Oliver. Right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. You brought that into the public domain anyway, Oliver, so thank you very much for that. And finally, we'll just go back to John Scott, please. The last question, John.
Thank you very much, Convener. I'll just go back to Gail Patterson, who said that, excuse me, we'd be missing a trick if we weren't including people in lower incomes. And I agree with that. And I agree with much that the Minister has said about the need for greater flexibility. But I also think we'd be missing a trick if we are not doing more to attract people from the private sector as well. And I would refer her to the applicant feedback information that we have in our papers, which I think applies across the board, wherein the Commissioner recently published a report on applicant research for 2019, and more than one applicant surveyed felt that the process was a closed shop. So a closed shop, Minister, I'm not quite certain what that suggests, but I do think we probably all in our own minds have different ideas of what a closed shop would mean. But so what are you going to do to ensure there is a level playing field for all our applicants, and what can be done to make recruitment more accessible and less intimidating for those with no experience of serving on public boards? And I would say the biggest group that is neglected is the private sector. By far.
Thanks very much. I think this committee session has demonstrated the importance of diversity, but obviously each committee member has asked me a different question in terms of what particular group we're doing more of to represent. Now, these are not necessarily exclusive, so some of the protected characteristics are not exclusive of one another, and certainly talking about private or public are not exclusive either. The thing that overrides all of this is demystifying the process, being really clear about the experiences that we need, and then going out to ensure that public appointments are promoted, and they're promoted in such a way as to encourage a diverse range of applicants to apply. When people from the private sector do apply, they normally do quite well. So clearly the challenge there is actually in inviting people to apply in the first place, and demystifying the process to such an extent that they feel comfortable and confident in applying. That is true of the private sector. It's just as true of the conversations we've just had on socio-economic background. It's just as true for the questions that Oliver Mundell asked about disability and ethnic minorities, and indeed young people. So if there's a sense in which the public at large, the people of Scotland own these bodies and should be represented on their boards to reflect the diversity of our population, then I think we'll start to resolve the issue. A lot of work has gone in already, and that's why you're seeing that incremental improvement in representation. But clearly, based on this conversation and other conversations, more needs to be done and more will be done.
Thank you very much.
On that point, if I may, thank you, Convener. I mean, I've asked the committee when we first discussed this for examples of good practice, and we got several examples of good practice. These case studies, notes say, have been acknowledged by panel chairs on behalf of appointing ministers for the round's concerns as representative of good practice, but the practices set out therein apparently have not been codified and subsequently rolled out by the Scottish Government as the new standard. So if not, why not? And will you in future look to build on the good practice examples that are there?
Cabinet Secretary, please.
Already identifying and sharing good practice as standard practice. No, officials share good practice and learning both within the public appointments team and then across board areas. And we're of the view that the current process to identify and use evidence in good practice is already established and it works well. So in a few instances where rounds don't deliver the right calibre of people, adding yet further prescription to appointment plans would be unnecessarily restrictive and would add further bureaucracy when feedback from boards, from applicants, from selection panels point to the need for greater flexibility within the process. So there is already a tried and tested way of sharing good practice. We are open to embedding good practice. There's no motivation to overcomplicate the appointments process or to put hurdles in the way of the best applicants applying. So yes, we share good practice. We will continue to share good practice. We will continue to take into account feedback. We have regular feedback loops, feedback processes from applicants themselves, and in fact 80% of applicants in the ESC survey said that the process was clear. And 90% of the applicants said that they applied because they had the skills that matched the advert. So there's already good practice in sharing best practice, and we regularly take into account the feedback, whether it's through surveys or through the formal appointment process.
Thank you very much.
I hear other people suggest that that's not been the case, and you might want to look further into that, that the examples of good practice are not being built on as far as our information tells us. So I note your optimism and your ebullience about that, but I do think it actually needs closer examination, if you'll forgive me.
Thank you very much, John. And just finally, on the back of this, Neil Finlay, please.
I can't recall which witness gave evidence, but they did suggest that there was something missing at a governmental level, a ministerial level, to drive this agenda, and that effectively the minister in charge had taken their eye off the ball on this. Now, given where we've been over the last year, I wouldn't expect this to be the number one priority of the Minister, namely yourself, Cabinet Secretary. I understand being very busy with other things. However, it would be quite refreshing if ministers just to say, look, yeah, we accept our eyes have been off the ball on this, and we will now take action. Is that the case?
Cabinet Secretary, please.
No, it's not the case that eyes have been off the ball. But I think what this conversation illustrates, and what feedback that I look at illustrates, is that there is a lot of progress to be made on improving the diversity within our boards. I don't think that is unique to either the board appointment process, or indeed to the Scottish Parliament, or indeed to any private sector boards either. Right across Scotland, right across every sphere and region and demographic, there is a lack of diversity. We've had extensive conversations on a political level within Parliament about the lack of diversity, and steps need to be taken to resolve that. That also applies within the public appointments area, and I think the figures that I've shared today have shown that incremental progress in the right direction. Is there more that needs to be done? Absolutely. Are we willing and open to suggestions for improvement? Yes. Do we take our role extremely seriously about ensuring that diverse applicants apply and then are successful? Yes. So my commitment to the committee this morning is to take away any and all suggestions for what we can do better, to reflect on that very, very carefully, to come back to the committee. But I don't think this is a problem that is unique to either the board appointment process, or indeed to just the Scottish Government. I think it's an issue right across society.
Well, look, thank you very much indeed for that. Thanks to all members for their questions, and I'd very much like to thank the Cabinet Secretary, and she did say she'll get back to us in writing on one or two issues. But I'd like to thank the Cabinet Secretary and Helen Miller very much indeed for attending today. And we can see that the sun doesn't always shine in Dingwall, but it's pouring in through your window there, so we'll let you go. And thank you both very much indeed. Thank you. Okay. Right. Well, thanks very much for that, everyone. And we'll move on to our next item, agenda item 5, and that's Cross-Party Group Annual Report. And it's for the committee to consider an annual update on the cross-party group's compliance with the Code of Conduct. You'll have received the papers, and I can ask if anyone has any comments that they would like to make at this stage. I don't see anything, and if not, I would therefore like to invite members to note the report and confirm they don't wish to take any action against any of the groups who may have just been breached Code of Conduct. So with that, we'll take note of that report, and we will now move into private and onto Teams, please. Thank you very much.